So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bartels. She will speak on the effects of environmental noise, annoyance, sleep disturbance, and blood pressure in vulnerable group.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome and the introduction. I'd like to present not a review or overview of our research, but I would like to present you some original data from recent studies we conducted on the effects of environmental noise, specifically aircraft noise, on annoyance, sleep disturbance, and blood pressure in vulnerable groups. You may know this graph on the biological indirect pathways through which environmental noise can impact health, proposed by the European Environmental Agency. And you can see, and you already know, that noise exposures can act via acute effects on sleep disruption or also on stress, at shorthand over medium, long term, to inflammation, oxidative stress, and in the long run, leading to a higher risk for cognitive, metabolic, cardiovascular, mental, or other diseases, dysfunctions, or disorders. But I don't want to go into detail about the mechanisms. I would like to focus on two acute effects, that is sleep disruption, awakenings, perceived sleep disturbance and fragmented sleep, and on the other hand on stress response. Here in this case I would highlight annoyance and activation of the sympathetic nervous system with special focus on acute impact on blood pressure. And I would like to specifically focus on the individual vulnerability by highlighting the impacts of aircraft noise, specifically nocturnal aircraft noise, on vulnerable groups, that is in this case children and older people. So why are children and older people vulnerable or expected to be more susceptible to noise, specifically aircraft noise? I think the answer is quite plausible. Children are in a sensitive developmental phase. They have lower risk awareness and coping ability towards noise, and specifically for nocturnal noise, they are more susceptible because they are for longer times exposed. They sleep longer, including times with busy times of the day. Older people undergo age-related changes in their sleep. They have less deep sleep. They spend longer times awake. Per se, their sleep is assumed to be more fragile and thus more susceptible to environmental stressors, and often age comes together with pre-existing disease. So this was our motivation to look specifically on the effects of aircraft noise on these two vulnerable groups, because the vast majority of research focus on the general but not on the vulnerable population. What did we do? We conducted two studies. We tested, on the one hand, 51 sleeping, healthy, normal hearing children in the age 8 to 10 years. On the other hand, we tested 44 healthy, normal hearing, and also normotensive people in the age of 55 to 76. We examined our participants in the field studies at their participants' home around Cologne-Bonn. That is an airport and European hub with a 24/7 traffic scheme, including a high number of nocturnal aircraft noise events. And as you can see here, while our participants slept during the night, we recorded all noise events near the subject's ear. Simultaneously, they underwent polysomnography, and in the evening and the morning, they replied to several questionnaires and scales, for instance, about annoyance and disturbance during the past night, general conditions, general health conditions, and well-being, and so on. And in sum, we focused on blood pressure, In the children's sample, we measured blood pressure in the evening and in the morning for a subsample of 19 participants, so it's rather an explorative study in this case. We used triple measurements, but for the older people, we conducted ambulatory blood pressure measurement during the whole night with intervals of 30 minutes. And here again, we used only a subsample that included 33 participants. So let's look first at the effect of nocturnal aircraft noise on the total impact, on the total night effects. And for this, I would like to compare sleep quality parameters in nights with lower exposure versus nights with higher aircraft noise exposure defined by median split. And as you can see, the sleep efficiency in the children's sample was slightly decreased in the higher exposure nights. For the wake time during the sleep period time, we found a significant effect saying that children in higher exposed nights were awake for 7 minutes more often than children in the lower exposed nights. And most remarkably, we found significant effects on the deep sleep duration, showing that in higher exposed nights, the duration of deep sleep was reduced by around about 17 minutes. We did the same comparison for older people, and what we see here were a bit smaller effects, or almost no effects. We saw a non-significant trend that sleep efficiency is reduced in higher exposed nights. We saw again a trend that the wake time is increased during higher exposed nights. It's actually again the 7 minutes difference, but because of the high variation in the sleep quality and the wake time between the participants, the result is not significant. And in terms of deep sleep duration, we found actually a very surprising result indicating that the amount of deep sleep increases during higher exposed nights. We definitely have to look here at the spectrum and do some spectral analysis. How deep was the sleep really? Here we were only looking at the episodes, at the epochs defining several sleep stages. So still some work to do here. But when we are looking at sleep disturbance, we are not only looking at total night effects, but also at sleep fragmentation and awakening probabilities. And to compare the effects in vulnerable groups, we often do a comparison to persons from the middle age group. And here we used a random sample from a prior study conducted also at the Cologne-Bonn airport. And you can see here an exposure response curve showing the association between the maximum sound pressure level of an aircraft noise event and the probability for a noise-associated change to the wake stage or to sleep stage 1 that is considered non-restorative. What we found for children is a clearly lower awakening probability compared to the middle-aged group that was also significant. And surprisingly, we also found a reduced awakening probability for the same exposure for older participants. It was a bit surprising because we assumed, based on the literature, that sleep and also awakening is a larger problem for older participants, since their sleep is considered more fragile. Now let's look at annoyance as a form of stressor. We ask all our participants how much did aircraft noise bother, disturb, or annoy you last night. And here you can see an exposure response curve showing the association between the aircraft noise exposure during the time in bed and the probability for at least moderate annoyance. Here you can see the relation for the medium age group, and obviously annoyance due to aircraft noise in the night is not a problem for children, but it is a problem for older participants. We saw a trend that older people are more annoyed at the same exposure than medium-aged. And finally, let's look at some acute effects on blood pressure. Again, we compared higher exposed nights to lower exposed nights. And for the systolic blood pressure, we found that children in higher exposed night showed in the morning a higher systolic blood pressure, slightly enhanced by 2.5 millimeter of mercury. The effect was non-significant. Also non-significant was the effect or the trend for higher diastolic blood pressure, whilst there was absolutely no trend in an increase in heart rate in the morning. The picture is slightly different for older people. Here we found a relatively strong effect facing the small sample size. People in higher exposed night showed during the night, on average, by 8 millimeter of mercury higher systolic blood pressure, and this effect was significant. In terms of diastolic blood pressure, we found only a slight increase, a non-significant trend for an increase during higher exposed nights, and we also found a non-significant trend for higher heart rate during the nights that were higher exposed compared to lower exposed. So to sum up very shortly, in terms of children, I think we can summarize that the effects that were found were small, but they are recurring, and for this they are very relevant. To understand the relevance of these small changes, we looked at the children with OSAS, and there was a paper reporting very similar effects for wake time, deep sleep reduction, and sleep efficiency reduction in children with OSAS, and you all know what are the long-term consequences of this OSAS. Children showed lower awakening probability, that is clear, but these lower probabilities can be leveled out by a higher number of aircraft noise events. As I said, they sleep much longer and are exposed to much more events than adults. And we saw a trend for acute effects in blood pressure. This is in line with prior epidemiological findings. For instance, Barbich found a significant effect of children whose bedrooms are facing low traffic street versus higher traffic street of nearly 2 millimeter of mercury. And to sum up, we really want to highlight the high vulnerability due to the longer exposure of children. For older people, we would like to subsume everything under the title Focus on the Stress Response. We found no or very small effects on sleep quality, lower awakening probability than for younger and medium age adults, but we found a trend for higher annoyance. This is probably due to the fact that older participants are awake during the night much longer than medium age participants, so they have a higher risk or a higher chance, as you like to say, to hear, to perceive the aircraft noise and also get annoyed by it. We found acute effects on blood pressure. They are in line with prior findings, but we can say that they are larger. To conclude, I would highlight the high vulnerability regarding annoyance and cardiovascular reactions for older people, This was also a conclusion by a very recent review by Minkin, but higher vulnerability is not true in terms of sleep disturbance, at least based on our data. And with this, I'd like to say thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Susanne, I understand now Professor Reiser, the chairman of today's session and today's meeting, will present the lecture on the noise, of course, non-environmental noise as a cause of hypertension, epidemiological and experimental evidence.